Greetings from Seaside United Methodist Church for today's Lenten lunch message. You'll notice, of course, I'm here from the Seaside Sanctuary rather than the Calvary Baptist Sanctuary because I had a bit of a scheduling conflict with recording, but I want to say a word of thanks to everyone at Calvary who has been working on these messages to get them to us, and just share a word of appreciation to them for all of their hard work during these Lenten digital lunch sermon series. I know that you have enjoyed the messages that have been brought to you so far, and I hope that during today's time you will continue to be blessed as you continue to travel through your Lenten journey. Let us begin with a moment of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for being here with us today. We thank you for the ways in which you have carried us through this time. Bless this time together that we may know you more. Amen. Well, as I begin this time today, I want to ask you a question that you can answer there to yourself at home. Has this ever happened to you where, let's say you need to go to Food Lion to pick up some groceries, and you hop in your car, you start the engine, you pull out of the driveway, and the next thing you know, oh my goodness, you're in the Food Lion parking lot. And you don't even remember driving there. You don't remember how you got there. You don't remember even making the trip. Somehow you just know that you've arrived. Has something like this ever happened to you before? I think it probably has. I'm pretty sure it's happened to everyone who drives. Now, of course, we're not talking about memory loss here. We are talking about mindfulness or lack of it. I don't know about you, but so often I get behind the wheel and I just sort of go on to autopilot. In my 2-mile drive each day from my home to Seaside, I have so many things on my mind, like the meetings ahead of me, or the class that I need to teach that day, or the person who's in the hospital, or maybe even, did I remember to feed the cats? Do you notice what's not on that list of what I'm thinking about? Driving. This happens to us a lot, not just with driving, but in many things. You know, perhaps there are times when you're in a worship service and maybe you're not even tuned into the sermon or the music, right? Especially during this time of COVID when you're watching worship in front of a screen and it's so easy for the mind to go to other places. Or how about maybe at night you're home and you're settled in and you turn the television on, but before you know it, you have no idea what the plot of the show even is that you're watching because your mind is somewhere else. This seems to be how we live our lives. We live our lives sort of somewhere else. We live our lives in a way that is very not present to the present. Well, today's word refers back to one of the devotionals that was offered in our GSMA Lenten devotional from March the 3rd, where the author points to Psalm 77:2. Just one verse in a psalm where the psalmist is obviously longing for yet missing the presence of God. The psalmist writes, "In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying, and my soul refuses to be comforted." Maybe this is where you find yourself today as we are beginning our descent into the darkest time of the Lenten season. Maybe this is where you find yourself after a year of isolation and loneliness and COVID fatigue. Maybe this is where you find yourself today for all sorts of reasons in your own day of trouble, asking, "Where are you, God?" This is indeed a difficult question, especially because we tend to ask this question during the most difficult times of our lives. But how often do we put the responsibility of God's presence solely on God and neglect our own role in that relationship? In looking for some answers to this question, I was drawn to another very familiar psalm, the 23rd Psalm, and especially the last verse. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The author of this psalm envisioned a life day by day wherein the shepherd would be present. But notice that this closing verse is not just an indication that God would be present to him, but also that the psalmist would be present to God. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me. This is a declaration of faith and confidence that no matter where the psalmist may find himself, he would be accompanied by this goodness and mercy. In other words, God. God's presence would be unwavering and faithful, and God would journey with him both through the dark valleys as well as into the green pastures. But then he writes, "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." This is a declaration of commitment from the psalmist back to God, that his choice would also be to enter into this unending and faithful presence. You see, presence has to be a two-way street. It takes a commitment on both sides for presence to have impact, for presence to be a real relational exchange. Now, I don't know about you, but something that drives me super crazy is when I go out to dinner, especially before COVID, right? And I see a nice couple or a family having dinner together, and what are they all doing? They all have their phones right in front of their faces. Now, they would tell you, yes, the family went out to dinner together tonight. I would ask, really? I mean, sure, you may have been physically present, but did you experience presence? It's just like when people come to me to talk, and yet they can't separate themselves from their cell phones long enough to even tell me what it is they want to talk to me about, right? We have a very, very, very hard time being present with one another. And this is frightening to me, and here's why. Because if we're having such a difficult time being present with flesh and blood, how difficult is it becoming to be present to the great mystery, to the one who is invisible? This ending to Psalm 23 poses both a promise and a challenge to us. God will be with you always, but will you be with God always? In the days of the psalmist, to be in God's presence was to be in the tabernacle or the temple, for this is where God was believed to be. So this image of dwelling in God's house forever was a reference to dwelling in God's presence forever. But we who live on this side of Pentecost, and I know we're not there yet, but we know that we are the temple now in which God dwells. You and me and everyone is invited to house the very presence of God. This lesson has been especially important to us over this last year, hasn't it? As many of us have been unable to go to church, the Spirit has longed to teach us that we are church, that God's presence is not limited to a building that is built by hands, but it is limited by our ability to be awake and present to God's presence. In another one of my favorite passages in the New Testament, Acts 17, 22 through 29, the Apostle Paul tells the Athenians that this unknown God that they worship is not a God who lives in a temple, but rather this is the God who gives life and breath to everything. This is the God in whom we live and move and even exist. God is life itself, and it is only by that constant presence of life around us that we can exist. Do you hear that? That it's only by this unending presence of God that any of this is even here. Paul also tells these Athenians that God is not far from any of us. It almost paints the picture, right, of the Spirit of Christ, the Creator who hovered over the waters in the beginning, continuing to hover and sustain all things. It is this same Spirit that is waiting for us to be awakened to this presence, the presence of the divine presence. This Spirit of God holds all things together, regardless of our awareness of it, regardless of anything we've done to deserve it, but rather because of this goodness and mercy that follow us. Now, it's been said that being awake to the presence of God is the easiest of spiritual disciplines to do, but it's the hardest one to remember to do. It's unfortunate that we've sort of compartmentalized our culture and we put God's presence into the category of sacred and the rest of our lives into the category of ordinary. So, sure, when we come to worship, we expect to experience God's presence. When we go in prayer, we expect God to be present. But on the golf course, some of us maybe don't want God present on the golf course, right, with how upset we get. What about cooking dinner? God doesn't really show up in the kitchen, right? Or how about in line at Walmart? Definitely we don't expect God's presence there, right? Because those things are not holy and sacred. But the beauty here is that God's presence is not contained in the sacred. God's presence turns the ordinary into the sacred, into the holy. It is God's presence that transforms even each breath that we take into a kingdom-building moment. But we can only see that when we intentionally live into these moments and offer each of them up to God as a life of worship and as an invitation for the divine. This is indeed a spiritual discipline. The hard work is not in having to do something, but rather in simply remembering. The hard work is in retraining our minds to recognize that despite the circumstances that surround us, despite our feelings or our activities or our fears, our doubts, our pains, despite how good we are or how far maybe we've strayed from goodness, God is present right now, in this moment. And in this one, and in this one. God is never going to be more present to you than right now. God's love for you is never going to be any deeper than it is right now. And God's grace will never cover you more fully than it does right now. And right now. And right now. It's okay to ask the question, where are you, God? But when you ask that question, you then have to ask yourself, where am I? Because the answer to the first question is most certainly dependent upon the answer to the second. The answer to that question relies on your decision to be awake to God, to be present to God's presence. As Paul said to the Athenians, this is truly the only way that we can live and move and have our being. Where are you, God? Look, and you will find God in many places. In your mundane life, in your most difficult struggles, in your successes, and in your failures. Because just as we will see in a few weeks, where we will find God is nailed to a cross. This is where Lent is leading us, to a never-ending presence that holds us, to a never-ending love that saves us. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to the goodness and mercy that follow us. Let us choose to dwell in God's presence forever. Amen.